Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the place that helps you make sense of that huge pile of sources, finding those crucial nuggets so you can get informed fast.
And today, we are definitely diving deep.
Oh yeah, we're plunging into a topic that, well, it hasn't just dominated headlines, has it? It feels like it's fundamentally reshaped how we understand international relations, security, everything, really.
Absolutely. It's a sea change.
And you've asked us to unpack some really big questions. Things like, what is the future of NATO? What's the path forward for Russia? And maybe the biggest one, how does the war in Ukraine shape all of this? And, where is that war ultimately going?
Yeah, the million-dollar questions, right? It's a really complex puzzle.
It is. But we've got some fascinating material to work with, reports, analyses, even some pretty lively online discussions. So let's get into it. Let's unpack this.
Indeed. It's a really profound, kind of multifaceted shift we're seeing play out on the global stage. Our source material today is pretty extensive.
Yeah.
We've got comprehensive reports from the European External Action Service, the EES, and some really sharp analyses from places like the Atlantic Council, the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI.
Some heavy hitters.
Definitely. And they all paint this vivid picture of a world moving fast from what was, largely seen as a unipolar moment.
Right, the U.S.-dominated era.
Exactly. Moving from that to a renewed and frankly intense era of great power competition. And the war in Ukraine, well, it isn't just some regional conflict off to the side.
Yeah.
It's acting as this powerful, undeniable catalyst. It's forcing a fundamental rethink of defense, of security, of global alliances. We'll be looking at the hard data, the complex economic realities.
Which are huge.
Huge, and also that often hidden battle, the battle for information, which really defines this new geopolitical chapter. What's really fascinating here, I think, is just how interconnected these questions are.
Yeah.
NATO's future is deeply tied to Russia's trajectory, and both are being irrevocably shaped by what's happening in Ukraine. So we'll explore those connections for you.
Okay, so let's start with that big picture shift. For decades after the Cold War, you constantly heard talk of a unipolar moment, right? The U.S. is the unchallenged global power. You had Francis Fukuyama famously writing about the end of history, suggesting liberalism had basically won. The big ideological fights were over.
A very influential idea at the time.
It was. Maybe a bit comfortable looking back, perhaps a bit complacent. But our sources are crystal clear. That narrative has dramatically and really quite suddenly shifted.
Dramatic.
Much faster than many expected, I think. That underlying assumption of a stable, predictable world order, it feels completely upended.
That's absolutely right. An analysis we looked at from the Spanish Institute for Strategic Studies, the IE really hammers this point home.
Okay.
They make it clear the geopolitical landscape has profoundly shifted away from that unipolar world, back to a distinct, undeniable return to great power competition.
And they pinpoint the trigger.
They do. They point directly to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 as the unequivocal and stark example of this new reality.
Bringing war back to Europe.
Exactly. Bringing high-intensity conflict back to European soil after nearly 25 years of, let's say, relative calm. And this reintroduction of large-scale conventional war has predictably created this profound, pervasive sense of concern, especially within the EU, wouldn't you say?
Well, absolutely. An EU that had maybe grown accustomed to a very different kind of security environment.
Precisely.
So it's just such a stark contrast to that post-1991 period we got used to. The IE notes, China was booming economically, but relations with the West were relatively stable. And Russia, well, despite the shock of the Soviet collapse, it also kept fairly decent relations with Europe for quite a while.
It did. That period, perhaps comfortable, perhaps fragile, is undeniably over now. And this shift means security and defense, well, they're not abstract concepts anymore, are they?
Not at all.
They're not secondary considerations for European nations. They are now, unequivocally, the top priorities right across the continent.
And it's not just about bigger budgets, is it?
No, not just that. It fundamentally alters the strategic thinking around existing alliances like NATO, and it redefines the very nature of conflict itself. What's really critical to grasp, I think, is that this competition goes way beyond just traditional military stuff, tanks, troops,
Right.
The source material highlights this crucial, often unseen battle that's unfolding in the information space.
The FEMI aspect we'll get to.
Exactly, where narratives get weaponized and the digital realm becomes a primary theater of operations. It's a fundamental change in how global power is exercised, how it's contested.
So if the world is entering this new era of competition, what does that actually mean for NATO? The cornerstone of transatlantic security. It feels like the alliance isn't just relevant, it's maybe more vital than ever.
That's the consensus, yeah.
And this is where it gets really interesting because the whole story around NATO has shifted so dramatically from people questioning its purpose after the Cold War.
Brain dead, some said.
Right. To now affirming its absolute necessity in the face of this renewed aggression.
Absolutely. That IR report highlights exactly that. The war in Ukraine has brought NATO squarely back to its original foundational tasks: deterrence and collective defense.
Back to basics, in a way.
In a very serious way. This isn't theory anymore. It's a very real, present imperative. The 2022 Madrid Strategic Concept, that's NATO's key guiding document, it explicitly identifies Russia as the most direct and significant threat to Allied security and peace in the Euro-Atlantic area.
No mincing words there.
Not at all. And this new context, it's directly influenced NATO strategies, its commitments, especially when it comes down to what member states are actually willing to contribute to invest.
And speaking of investment, we've seen a pretty remarkable development on defense spending, haven't we? For years, that 2% of GDP target felt like, well, a bit of a struggle for many members. Often talked about, rarely met across the board.
It really was a struggle, a constant point of friction, often. But sources like The Insider and Ion Analytics confirm what really amounts to a landmark agreement.
What's the headline?
At the NATO summit on June 25th, the members officially adopted a new defense spending target: 5% of GDP by 2035.
5%. Why?
5%. It's a significant jump from that long-standing 2% guideline. You've got figures like the U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, Germany's Boris Pistorius, openly calling the 2% target outdated.
So the pressure was building.
Tremendous pressure. And what's really striking here isn't just the amount of money involved, which is vast, obviously. It's the profound psychological shift it represents, particularly for Europe. Well, it's a stark departure from decades of prioritizing social welfare, internal development over really robust defense spending. It almost redefines the European project, signaling a return to a more traditional and, yes, more expensive form of security.
And Germany's on board. They were often seen as hesitant.
They are. Germany, initially hesitant, is now reportedly ready to commit to this 5% target. That signals a major shift in European strategic thinking in their priorities.
I do remember hearing there was some pushback initially, given the sheer economic implications of going from 2% to 5%.
Oh, there was. Particularly from Spain, actually. Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez initially blocked an earlier version of the text. He called it unreasonable and counterproductive for Spain at that specific moment.
Why?
Well, Spain was emphasizing the short-term economic benefits, like job creation, coming from their existing defense spending increases. They pointed to steady growth, record tax revenues. Madrid had already pledged an extra $10.5 billion to meet the old 2% target, arguing this would create up to 100,000 jobs without needing cuts to pensions or health care.
So highlighting that tension between immediate economics and long-term security.
Exactly. That inherent tension was right there. But despite that initial objection, consensus was ultimately reached, which really underscores the collective urgency, the perceived necessity of this bigger commitment across the whole alliance.
It shows the threat perception was strong enough to overcome those national concerns.
Precisely. Even with diverse national priorities, the threat perception unified them enough to push through what is, historically, a very challenging target.
Okay, so beyond the money, what about the actual growth of the alliance? Finland and Sweden joining that feels like a really big deal, strategically.
It is a very big deal, a clear demonstration of NATO's, you could say, magnetic pull in a time of threat. The Week reports Finland joined April 2023. Sweden followed March 2024 after that whole saga with Hungarian and Turkish objections.
Right. That took a while.
It did. But their entry significantly bolsters NATO's resources. Both countries bring advanced military capabilities, robust defense industries,
And experience with Russia.
and critically, yes, a deep understanding of Russian military doctrine, Russian geography, thanks to those long shared borders. But as the U.S. Institute of Peace pointed out, their biggest contribution is arguably geostrategic.
How so?
Their accession effectively shores up NATO's previously exposed northeastern flank. It provides a crucial shield for the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, which are often seen as potentially vulnerable. And the IE report also uses Finland's integration as clear proof of NATO's continued relevance, its expansion, even long after its original enemy, the Soviet Union, disappeared. It shows how a perceived threat can really redefine and strengthen alliances in ways maybe thought impossible before.
And with this stronger ambition, bigger membership, what about NATO's actual readiness? Are they just talking about spending more, or are there solid plans for forces that can actually deploy quickly?
Oh, there are very concrete and ambitious plans. NATO's Readiness 2030 initiative, that's the key framework here. It aims to significantly boost military readiness across the board.
What are the numbers?
The goal is 100,000 troops deployable within 0-10 days for immediate crisis response, then another 200,000 within 10-30 days, and then up to 500,000, 500,000 within 180 days for larger, sustained operations.
That's a serious commitment. How do they ensure countries actually meet those standards?
Well, this is interesting. The IE report highlights a pretty significant measure.
Yeah.
Commanders can now conduct unannounced exercises and inspection visits to national units. Unannounced. It's a crucial step to verify that national forces actually meet the required readiness standards, avoid any, paper tiger scenarios where the commitment isn't backed by real capability.
Makes sense.
And remember, as a formal alliance, NATO members make binding commitments. Collective defense under Article 5, participation in operations, contributing assets. This isn't just a club, it's a formal, legally binding pact. It really emphasizes the shift from aspirational goals towards tangible, verifiable capabilities.
That's an incredible level of commitment forces, readiness, inspections. But like anything on this scale, there have got to be major implications, especially economically, right? What do the sources say about the trade-offs Europe is facing now?
Indeed, it comes with significant economic ripples, absolutely. Now, the Kiel Institute suggests that if defense spending goes up to around 3.5% of GDP, and if it's focused on high-tech, domestically sourced stuff, it could boost GDP by 0.9, 1.5% annually, stimulate innovation in AI, cybersecurity.
So potentially some economic upside.
Potentially. But the insider warns that this huge $800 billion planned new weapons infrastructure production could inevitably lead to a rise in public debt across the EU. Fitch, the ratings agency, they warn that without extra fiscal measures, EU budget deficits could surge from below 3% to maybe around 6% of GDP in just a few years.
Wow, 6%. That's a serious challenge to financial stability, isn't it?
Yeah.
Could undermine economic recovery efforts.
Precisely. And it's particularly tough for countries already grappling with high debt. Think Italy, Greece, they went into this buildup with the debt to GDP ratios around 150%, even 200%.
Yeah.
They face much tighter budget constraints. Fitch notes if their defense spending hits 3-4%, up from their current 2%, it could mean significant deficits, potentially credit rating downgrades for EU countries. That makes borrowing more expensive.
And even for the big players, Germany, France.
Even for them, they're planning to move towards 3%, and the implications are substantial. It's this incredibly delicate balancing act between urgent security needs and maintaining economic stability. It's a tension that's going to dominate domestic politics for years, I suspect.
And it's not just about the abstract numbers, is it? There are real social, political consequences if money gets diverted from other areas to defense, things that affect people's daily lives.
Absolutely. Economic and labor organizations are already sounding the alarm. They're warning that channeling these huge public funds into armaments could mean cuts in social spending, vital job creation programs.
That's politically explosive.
It is. The Insider highlights particular outrage from some trade unions about discussions around using money from the EU's cohesion funds. That's about $400 billion originally meant for regional development, reducing disparities.
Redirecting that to defense?
Redirecting it to strengthen the defense of frontline states. Critics argue this could undermine other crucial priorities, healthcare, education, infrastructure, and potentially trigger a painful political backlash.
And potentially empower certain political groups.
Exactly. The article mentions this could inadvertently strengthen fringe, mostly far-right parties who tend to capitalize on public unhappiness over perceived sacrifices.
So this idea of security on credit, as some call it, it has a time limit, a reckoning down the line.
That seems like a fair way to put it. The European Commission's current measures, they offer temporary relief. Between 2025 and 2028, defense spending is excluded from the EU's strict deficit rules. That gives some breathing room.
But only temporary.
Only temporary. After that period, countries will have to rebalance their budgets. For many, that means very difficult choices down the road. Economists warn high debt means high interest rates, potentially forcing future governments to raise taxes, cut pensions, reduce other essential services.
Has the ECB weighed in?
Yes, Klaus Knott, an ECB board member, has already voiced concerns. He noted increased military budgets inevitably mean higher government borrowing, which complicates inflation forecasts and monetary policy planning. It's this really complex web of economic pressures that could seriously test European economies and, frankly, public patience.
And just to add another layer of complexity, there's this looming threat of trade wars, especially potentially from the U.S., which could mess up Europe's defense plans even more.
This is another huge, unpredictable challenge. The Insider notes potential U.S. policies think Trump's announced a 25% tariffs on steel aluminum, 20% on many EU goods they threaten slow growth, drive up costs for European businesses. That directly impacts the industrial capacity needed for defense.
How much are we talking?
The EU estimates those duties would hit exports worth around $26 billion. Brussels has already responded with its own retaliatory measures on American imports.
So a potential spiral.
Exactly. ABN, Amaro, and The Insider warn a full-blown global trade war could trigger price hikes across the board: energy, raw materials, critical electronics, all crucial components for modern weapons.
Which makes defense even more expensive.
Precisely. It could force the European defense sector to compete with cheaper Asian imports, fuel inflation more, limit financing options. Ultimately, if Europe can't maintain a stable trade environment, its defense ambitions are severely put at risk. It just shows how tightly economic stability and military capability are linked.
It really sounds like Europe is trying to find its own way forward in this new security world, not just following NATO's lead entirely. There's talk about strengthening the European dimension within NATO. What does that actually mean in practice?
Yeah, the IAU report clarifies this. The debate now is mostly focused on strengthening NATO's European dimension. It's a move away from those past EU ambitions for strategic autonomy, which some, particularly in the U.S., interpreted as Europe wanting to go it alone, independent from the U.S.
So it's not about competing with the U.S.
No, the idea now isn't to compete or duplicate efforts. It's about Europe being a stronger, more capable pillar within NATO, contributing more effectively to the collective security burden. The EU's own defense policy, the CSDP, has historically focused more on low-intensity crisis management outside the EU, not collective defense of the EU.
Right.
Their rapid deployment capability, the RDC, aiming for 5,000 troops by 2025. That's a huge reduction from a 60,000 troop goal they set way back in 1999.
Shows a bit of a reality check, maybe.
It reflects a persistent gap between ambition and reality for the EU's direct military capacity, and that underscores why the focus has shifted more towards the industrial side.
So the EU is focusing more on building its defense industry rather than deploying huge forces itself. It's about making their own kit.
Exactly. The EU is developing tools like PESCO, Permanent Structured Cooperation, and the European Defence Fund, EDF, specifically to strengthen its defense industrial base.
How?
Well, it involves encouraging consolidation, moving from lots of smaller, fragmented national defense companies to a few strong, integrated European players, and fostering joint ventures. A key emphasis, as the Insider highlights, is manufacturing equipment in Europe. At least 65% of components sourced from EEA countries or Ukraine.
A bi-European approach.
Pretty much. It aims to reduce dependence on outside suppliers, keep critical supply chains resilient in a crisis, build strategic industrial resilience. It's less about boots on the ground from the EU itself and more about ensuring the tools are available, made in Europe.
And where does the UK fit into this post-Brexit? That seems complicated.
It is complicated, but the DGAP source notes the UK's defense industry still has distinct advantages. Skills, technology, R&D. It makes the UK a valuable potential partner.
So cooperation is still possible.
Potentially. Forging a truly European defense industrial base could involve the UK joining big pan-European projects like the Franco-German future combat aircraft, even though they've left the EU. The IISC also points out that US support might be needed to encourage this kind of European defense industrial cooperation.
Why U.S. support?
Well, potentially to help counter opposition from the powerful American defense industry, which might not welcome a stronger, more independent European competitor. The ultimate goal is a stronger European pillar that complements NATO, makes the alliance more complete, more balanced, with shared burdens and better capabilities overall. But this shift towards greater European defense capability. The IIC says it's happening out of necessity rather than vocation for the EU.
Meaning
Meaning it's a pragmatic, urgent response to the changed world, driven by the very real threat they see on their eastern flank, not some long-held ideological desire for autonomy.
Okay, so NATO's strengthening. Europe's reevaluating its capabilities. What about Russia? The sources seem to paint this complex, almost contradictory picture. A nation under huge economic pressure, yet somehow still managing to wage war persistently.
Indeed. It's one of the central paradoxes. The Atlantic Council report asks that question directly. Is 2025 the year that Russia's economy finally freezes up under sanctions?
And the answer isn't simple.
Not at all. The initial hope, remember, was that sanctions would bite hard and fast, bring a swift end to the war.
Didn't happen.
Didn't happen immediately. But the report indicates there are now clear signs of significant deepening strain, even as Russia adapts its military and, crucially, its information strategies to keep going, to continue its offensive. The resilience it's shown is, frankly, remarkable, but it comes at a profound cost that's really starting to bite now.
What are the actual economic indicators showing that strain? Where are the cracks really appearing?
Well, the effects of sanctions, though delayed, are definitely deepening. The economy shrank 2.1% in 2022, then surprisingly grew in 2023 and 2024. Mostly due to a massive state-directed surge in defense spending. They basically put the economy on a war footing. But the full impact of the financial punishments is really manifesting now.
Like what?
Key indicators. The ruble has lost over half its value against the dollar and euro since the invasion. That makes imports way more expensive, crushes purchasing power. Russian oil exports dropped to around $64 a barrel from an initial $70 less government revenue, a critical blow given how much they rely on energy exports.
And inflation.
Rising inflation is a huge concern. Even President Putin acknowledged it, describing the economy as overheating. The fact he addressed it publicly, which he rarely does, suggests it's serious and the Kremlin is struggling to manage it.
And the human cost of the war, beyond the battlefield casualties, is hitting their workforce too.
Yeah.
How's that playing out economically?
Absolutely. The Atlantic Council highlights severe labor shortages as a critical factor. Industrial factories, even those repurposed for military production, are running at only about 81% capacity. Why? Manpower issues caused by the war.
Mobilization, casualties.
Hundreds of thousands conscripted, pulled out of civilian jobs. Tragically, the high casualties the report mentions, over 800,000 dead and injured since the start, mean many injured can't return to work, a permanent loss to the labor force.
And recruitment efforts drain the civilian sector too.
Yes, big signing bonuses for military service entice recruits away, especially from poorer regions with few other opportunities. This massive shift of human capital to the war effort inevitably impoverishes Russians in other areas of their lives. Funds get slashed for things like scientific research, healthcare, infrastructure. The forecast, according to the Atlantic Council, economic recession in 2025. That suggests the current war-fueled growth just isn't sustainable.
And business is leaving. Sanctions busting crackdowns.
That too. Thousands of Western companies have pulled out or suspended operations, less revenue, less access to tech and expertise. Banks have largely stopped trading, and there's an intensifying crackdown on sanctions busters, further isolating Russia economically.
Okay, so despite these really significant economic problems, Russia's military seems to be persisting, even advancing in some areas. How are they managing that?
RUSI's tactical report confirms it. The ground campaign maintains constant attritional pressure on Ukraine. They're mobilizing manpower relentlessly to feed this grind.
What kind of numbers?
Russia reportedly contracted over 400,000 additional troops in 2024 alone. They're expected to recruit more people than they lose in 2025, even with incredibly high daily casualty rates, over 200 killed per day, maybe over 1,200 total casualties per day by late 2024.
That's staggering. It shows a willingness to absorb immense losses.
It does, prioritizing quantity, sheer mass over the individual soldier. Industrially, they're significantly ramping up production of ammunition and key equipment. Over 70,000 UMPK glide bombs ordered for 2025 alone. That shows a focus on overwhelming firepower.
But our weakness is there. Quality issues.
There are indications. RSI notes a large proportion of ammunition for artillery is currently procured from North Korea and is of low quality. That suggests reliance on external, maybe unreliable suppliers. They also anticipate having fewer armored vehicles available in 2025, relying more on newly produced ones as older stocks run out. That could impact their mobility, their protection.
And what about the tactics and the morale of the troops themselves, given these brutal conditions, these high losses?
RSI paints a pretty grim picture here. Russian troops are apparently routinely threatened with severe punishment, even execution, if they retreat. It makes it, quote, safer to stay put and wait for reinforcements no matter how bad things get.
Creates a certain kind of discipline, I suppose.
A brutal kind. It ties personal survival to staying on the offensive, however hopeless it seems. Propaganda also plays a role, with some soldiers reportedly choosing suicide over capture, though Rarsai doesn't suggest this is widespread. But what's really striking, and maybe a key insight into their strategic calculus, is the motivation. Russian prisoners of war largely cite financial reasons for fighting the signing bonus, the pay, unlike Ukrainians who are fighting to defend their country, their homes.
And that difference matters.
RUSI suggests this fundamental difference in motivation influences their willingness to recover wounded or dead comrades. Russian troops reportedly seem less motivated to do this, sometimes leaving their fallen behind. It's a stark contrast.
So, beyond the economic pressures of the military grind, Russia is also waging this major, comprehensive information war. What does that actually look like? How widespread is it?
The ES report dives deep into this. It describes Russia's approach to information as complex, long-term, and employs both state and non-state structures. They explicitly use this concept of information confrontation. It's central to Russian doctrine.
Information confrontation.
Yeah. Information is defined as both the weapon and the environment. It's not just about misleading people, it's about fundamentally shaping and controlling the entire information space to achieve their geopolitical goals.
It's foundational to their foreign policy.
Absolutely. They use this sophisticated mix of overt channels, state media, like RT, Sputnik, and covert channels, to shape global narratives, push their objectives. And it's focused on long-term influence, not just short-term wins.
And who are the main targets? Is it just the West?
No, it's much broader. This foreign information manipulation and interference FAMI targeted over 80 countries and 200 organizations in the last year alone. That shows its global reach. Big targets include the EU, NATO, obviously.
And elections. Individuals.
Elections are a key target. 42 Russian FEMI attempts were recorded just during the June European elections, trying to influence democratic outcomes. High-profile individuals, too, EU leaders like Ursula von der Leyen, Kaja Kallas, Josep Borrell, they're targeted with smear campaigns, disinformation, trying to undermine trust and legitimacy.
What are the main tools and tactics, especially now with things like AI becoming more accessible?
Social media is still ground zero. X, formerly Twitter, accounted for a staggering 88% of detected activity. Why? Bot networks, disposable accounts, easy to create, use for a campaign, then ditch.
And fake websites.
Widely used. Websites mimicking legitimate Western media or creating entirely inauthentic news sites to spread propaganda. Campaigns like Doppelganger and False Facade are key examples here. And generative AI, it's increasingly used. It's a low-cost way to create convincing deepfake audios, videos, automate the spread of disinformation. The EES found about 41 cases last year where AI was used for manipulation. It's a growing and, frankly, alarming part of the toolkit.
That sounds incredibly sophisticated. Can you give us a bit more detail on some of those specific named Russian operations? Doppelganger, for instance.
Sure. Doppelganger is aimed at expanding Russian influence globally. It uses really targeted audience segmentation, localized manipulative content. It's multi-layered. Thousands of fake domains designed to game platform algorithms, sponsored ads on platforms like Meta driving traffic to deceptive sites, large-scale coordinated inauthentic behavior networks, CIBs for distribution.
And they even target fact-checkers.
Yeah, an insidious tactic called Operation Matryoshka involves amplifying disinformation in the comment sections of fact-checking organizations themselves, trying to subvert the very mechanisms meant to counter them.
Wow. What about false facade?
False Facade, also known as Storm 1516, or CopyCop, launched late 2023. It's a network of 230 inauthentic websites, English, French, German, meticulously designed to look like legitimate Western media. The EES calls it one of the most impactful campaigns.
What does it target?
Initially, it focused on weakening Western support for Ukraine, spreading disinformation about Ukrainian leaders, figures linked to Navalny, but it broadened its scope, election interference, targeting figures like Kamala Harris, Emmanuel Macron. Correcto reported it deployed interference activities targeting the 2025 German elections, and notably, it's connected to the Foundation for Battle and Justice, founded by the late Yevgeny Prigozhin.
Shows those blurred lines between state and private actors.
And Portal Combat. Portal Combat is another piece. It automatically republishes content, acts as a booster node, significantly expanded onto X in January 2025. It amplifies content from False Facade and also the African Initiative.
Tell us about the African Initiative.
It's basically the central hub for Russian FEMI in Africa now, taking over from Wagner-affiliated activities after Prigozhin died. It runs 16 websites, social media channels in 6 languages, setting up local branches in the Sahel, a key strategic area for Russia.
And it works both ways.
Exactly. That's what's fascinating. It pushes state-controlled content to local audiences, but also generates local content that feeds back into Russian international media, like Sputnik Afrique, creates this self-reinforcing echo chamber, and they do offline stuff too, demonstrations, journalist training to bolster Russia's influence on the ground.
It sounds like a truly comprehensive strategy. The Moldova case study illustrates how they can pivot this.
Yes, Moldova is a really clear, concerning example. Existing Russian FEMI infrastructure, like a Telegram channel previously focused on Ukraine, was deliberately repurposed to target Moldova's democratic processes, aiming to destabilize the country.
How?
Russian official channels the foreign ministry, spokesperson Maria Zakharova, seeded narratives into this ecosystem. Then a network of new local channels, Moldova 24, with direct links to RT, acted as the distribution backbone within Moldova. It shows how they can localize and weaponize information against specific, often vulnerable democracies on their borders.
And are they coordinating with China on any of this, or are these separate efforts?
The EES report explicitly says Russian and Chinese state media CGTN, Global Times, RIA Novosti, RT, Sputnik act as bridges to cross-amplify narratives when their goals align.
So tactical cooperation.
It suggests exactly that. Tactical cooperation in the information space. They can mutually reinforce each other's messages, especially those countering Western interests. It's a pragmatic partnership based on shared adversaries and strategic aims.
So China has its own FEMI operations too, beyond just coordinating with Russia.
Oh, absolutely. And they're equally sophisticated. China uses its state outlets, Global Times, CGTN, and diplomatic accounts as key nodes for official narratives. But they also rely heavily on what the report calls influence for hire companies.
Like commercial disinformation providers.
Essentially, companies like Shanghai Haixun Technology behind the Hey Energy campaign, 316 fabricated websites, or Shenzhen Haimiyungsang Media running the Paperwall campaign, 123 inauthentic websites.
And what do?
They often repurpose official Chinese government messaging, sometimes without saying where it came from, blurring the lines, making it harder to spot the origin. They exploit something called bulletproof hosting services, like Amazon Web Services, but configured to be highly resistant to takedown requests. Makes it incredibly difficult to remove their malicious content.
And their focus.
Their content often targets breaking news. Situations relevant to China's strategic interests, Taiwan, the South China Sea, allows them to rapidly deploy narratives serving their national interests. It's a very sophisticated, deeply integrated approach to shaping global views.
Okay, so with NATO bolstering itself, Russia grappling with economic issues but pushing hard militarily, and with this sophisticated info war, what does all this mean for the actual fighting in Ukraine? How is it playing out on the ground right now? And what does Ukraine truly need to just stabilize things?
The tactical analysis from RUSI, plus updates from ACLED and Relief Web, paints a grim but very detailed picture. It's a sustained high-intensity conflict. What's clear is both sides are adapting, constantly. But Ukraine faces immense pressure and relies heavily, sometimes critically, on that external support. The scale, the persistence of the fighting, it's staggering.
Let's get into the current dynamics.
Yeah.
As of June 2025, what's the assessment from the front lines?
Russian forces are making what RUSI calls significant advances in Donetsk. They've seized 7 settlements near Velika Novosilka, more near Pokrovsk, Toretsk, Lyman. RUSI notes Russia is slowly working its way through the Donetsk defense lines. It's a persistent, grinding advance. Incremental gains seem to be the priority.
Any Ukrainian successes?
Yes. Ukrainian forces managed to stabilize the front in Sumy, reclaimed a settlement north of Sumy city. That shows they can adapt, conduct successful local counterattacks, and Ukraine continues its crucial deep strike campaigns hitting Russian oil refineries, ammo dumps, defense factories, aiming to raise the cost of the war for Russia, disrupt their logistics deep behind the lines.
And Russia's long-range strikes are still a major factor, both militarily and for civilians.
Yes, relentlessly. Relief Web reports Russia continues record numbers of drone and missile attacks. One example, 400, 500 drones and missiles launched in a single night in June.
Devastating.
These inflict persistent, terrible damage on Ukrainian training bases, airfields, critical national infrastructure. The military aim, RUSI says, is clear. Fix Ukrainian air defenses, force them to use up precious interceptors, degrade Ukraine's ability to sustain operations, and the civilian impact remains heartbreaking. May 2025 saw 183 civilians killed, 836 injured, the second highest casualty month in 2025. Attacks hit Kyiv, Odessa, where a maternity hospital was struck, Dnipro. It highlights the widespread, often indiscriminate impact across the country.
What about the Russian offensive tactics driving these advances, especially given those high casualty rates we talked about?
RUSI identifies what they call the offensive triangle. It's this brutal, effective combination: massed FPV drones, persistent ISR intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and the increasing use of those UMPK glide bombs, 70,000 ordered for 2025.
And how do they use their troops?
A key tactic is reconnaissance by fire. Russian units, often poorly trained troops in small groups, maybe 8 to 30 soldiers, sometimes with an IFV, are sent forward specifically to draw Ukrainian fire.
To reveal positions.
Exactly. Identify Ukrainian positions for subsequent targeting with overwhelming artillery, FPVs, glide bombs. The actual assaults are often described as primitive. Armored vehicles drop troops close to positions, then it's infantry rushes, often with little coordinated fire and maneuver. The goal is just sheer mass, accumulate critical numbers to overwhelm defenders. And the tempo can be incredibly high. One Ukrainian brigade reported facing an average of 27 such section attacks per day in its sector.
And the threats against retreat we mentioned earlier play into this.
Yes, RUSI notes troops are routinely threatened with severe punishment, even execution if they fall back. It makes it safer for them to stay put, await reinforcements, regardless of the situation.
That sounds incredibly brutal, unimaginably tough for the Ukrainians facing it. What are their biggest challenges and how are they adapting?
Ukraine faces immense, complex challenges. RUSI describes personnel shortages as their foremost problem. Now, Ukraine does have manpower reserves, but the issues are around training the newly mobilized effectively, managing personnel efficiently, and crucially, maintaining morale among troops who've been serving for a long, long time and are exhausted.
What's hitting morale hardest?
It's a combination. Pervasive fatigue, obviously, the inability to rotate off the line for proper rest, the constant omnipresent threat of those glide bombs. RUSI states bluntly, no fortification offers adequate protection against them. That creates a feeling of constant vulnerability. Then there's low pay and issues with compensation for unrecovered dead, which hits families' financial security and erodes trust.
And equipment. Are they getting what they need? Is it always working as intended?
Well, there have been improvements, especially in 155 millimeter artillery ammo. They received 1.6 million shells in 2023, 1.5 million in 2024. But serious deficiencies remain. Artillery often underperforms. Why? Varied propellant quality from different donor countries, coordination issues between units. They also critically lack specialist munitions like bonus shells, which are vital for certain tactical advantages.
What about defenses? Fortifications?
Building adequate defenses manually is incredibly difficult, time-consuming. Combat engineers are invaluable for quickly building positions with heavy equipment, but they can't operate too close to the front because of the constant threat. There's a clear, urgent need for preemptive construction of new subterranean defense lines further back, especially behind Donetsk, to provide protected fallback positions and allow covered movement.
The sheer scale of casualties must also put an unbelievable strain on medical support. What's the reality of battlefield medicine?
This is a critical point, and the sources reveal a stark reality. Existing NATO medical doctrine is simply not executable under modern combat conditions.
Wow.
The scale of casualties is one thing, but also the constant threat to rear areas. Unlike past conflicts where evacuation routes might be relatively safe, the pervasive threat of long-range precision strikes, combined with the sheer volume of high-intensity trauma from artillery and glide bombs, means that traditional golden hour for casualty care, often impossible.
So what do?
It forces a radical rethink. More emphasis on immediate self-aid, peer care. Evacuation is deliberate, often severely delayed, sometimes taking days because of the battlefield conditions. Ukrainian soldiers take huge risks to recover comrades, often leading to more casualties themselves. They're using UAVs innovatively to deliver medical supplies, experimenting with uncrewed ground vehicles, UGVs for evacuation, but reliability is still a big problem.
And logistics, troop rotation, incredibly difficult too, I imagine.
Hugely difficult. Tactical resupply is a major challenge. RUSI estimates about 50% of Ukrainian casualties actually occur in the rear from Russian strikes targeting supply lines, assembly areas.
50%, wow.
Yeah, it forces constant adaptation in logistics. Minimizing rotations troops spending over a month, sometimes much longer, in position is a tactical adaptation to maintain presence, but obviously has severe morale implications. When rotations do happen, they're deliberate, dangerous operations supported by fire, electronic warfare, done at night or in bad visibility to try and avoid Russian targeting.
But Ukraine is also hitting back with sophisticated long-range strikes against Russia, right? Despite the pressure they're under.
That's correct. Although their deep strike campaign has limited fewer systems, Fewer resources compared to Russia, RUSI assesses it as at least as sophisticated, if not more so, than Russia's. They've developed highly efficient UAV routing to bypass Russian air defenses, saturate targets. It shows remarkable ingenuity. They've had a remarkably high success rate in damaging targets, though it comes at a high cost in terms of their own UAV expenditure. These strikes are crucial for degrading Russian military infrastructure, raising the cost of the war for the Kremlin, forcing them to divert resources to defense.
Okay, so given all these immense challenges Ukraine faces, what are the key recommendations coming out of these sources for NATO, for international partners, to actually support Ukraine effectively and help them sustain this fight?
RSI provides very clear, actionable recommendations across several critical areas. First, personnel and morale. They suggest improving troop pay, a tangible morale booster. Altering compensation rules, so photographic or geolocation evidence is enough for unrecovered dead that eases the financial burden on families. Critically, prioritize bringing existing experienced units up to full strength instead of constantly forming new, less cohesive ones. And enable regular unit rotation to combat that crushing fatigue.
And countering those deadly glide bombs.
Yes. To counter glide bombs, resource Ukraine's long-range strike program. Let them target Russian fueling points, rearming points, air bases, degrade Russia's aviation sector through various means, and improve detection and reaction capabilities for the UMPK glide bombs themselves, better radar, early warning, countermeasures.
Industrial capacity seems absolutely vital for the long haul.
It's critical. RUSI emphasizes the need to sustain investment in Europe to expand production of explosive energetics, shells. It's about building the capacity to produce ammo at scale independently, ensuring a consistent supply of replacement barrels, spare parts for artillery, providing more howitzers, all vital to keep existing systems running. They also recommend scaling up UAV production. These complement artillery, provide crucial ISR and strike capabilities more cheaply.
What about mechanization automation?
For mechanization and automation, the priority should be continued provision of IFVs, APC's infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers. RUSI emphasizes serviceability over extreme quality here, aiming for sufficient quantity. Support automation for air defense, counter-UAS systems, automated resupply using drones, and developing those UGVs for casualty evacuation, all areas where tech can reduce human risk and improve efficiency.
And for NATO itself, what lessons should they be taking away to update their own doctrine, prepare for potentially similar future conflicts?
This is maybe one of the most sobering takeaways. NATO militaries must update their medical doctrine. RUSI is blunt. Current NATO doctrine is not executable under modern combat conditions. Because of the casualty scale and the threat to rear areas, that golden hour concept often doesn't apply. It needs a fundamental rethink.
What else?
They need to implement all-arms counter-UAS capabilities, economical, sustainable ways to shoot down drones, reprogramming existing weapon stations, even counter-drone nets. European military should also reconsider their stance on cluster munitions and regenerate the ability to deploy anti-tank and anti-personnel mines, crucial for lethality and hindering enemy movement in high-intensity war. Stockpiling specialist munitions like bonus shells is also recommended.
And defense.
Given Russia is slowly working its way through the Donetsk defense lines, and the terrain behind is less defensible, international partners should help Ukraine with contingency planning for new subterranean defense lines. Build them preemptively where possible, obfuscate positions, enable covered movement away from constant Russian fire. It's a recognition that entrenched warfare has fundamentally changed.
So we've looked at NATO's transformation, the pressures on Russia, the brutal realities in Ukraine. But the biggest question for so many people listening remains, where does this all actually end?
And the sources offer a very sober assessment here. There's no silver bullet, no quick fix to end this conflict. Russia's strategic objective, as discussed in that Reddit forum we looked at, seems much broader than just Ukraine.
How so?
It seems to encompass this fundamental desire to prevent thriving democracies on its border, fearing they might influence its own population, and also to maintain its global position in what it perceives as a new Cold War. This even extends to forging alliances with China, Iran, North Korea, creating a larger, interconnected geopolitical challenge aimed at countering Western dominance. The goal feels existential for them, not just territorial.
So the war of attrition is basically expected to grind on. Given Russia's resilience, their willingness to absorb losses.
That seems to be the overwhelming consensus from the sources we reviewed. The Atlantic Council notes Russia's remarkable resilience facing sanctions, how they've effectively reoriented their economy to war production. Reddit users discuss Russia's apparent ability to fight a longer and bigger war without running out of men, given its large population, 140 million, and critically, what seems like a disregard for workforce demographics or the long-term economic impact of such high casualties.
And Ukraine's position?
Ukraine is succeeding in delaying advances, inflicting significant casualties, but, as Urisai says, at a high price in personnel. Their foremost military objective right now: stabilization of the front, prevent further losses, create conditions, eventually, for a more favorable political outcome. That points to a protracted, grinding conflict, not some decisive breakthrough anytime soon.
And what about the risks? Escalation on one hand, or maybe war exhaustion in the West, cutting off support on the other.
Both are very real, interconnected concerns. The week and various Reddit discussions explicitly warn of the danger. If Russia faces total defeat conventionally against NATO, it might force Moscow to use tactical nuclear weapons. That terrifying possibility shapes a lot of Western strategic caution.
And the war exhaustion.
Several Reddit users highlight this growing war exhaustion in Europe, in the USA. Populist politicians gaining ground in places like the Netherlands, Germany, France, often arguing for limiting aid to Ukraine. Concerns are raised that many in the West don't really care what happens to the borders in Eastern Europe, that they won't bother sacrificing their livelihoods over it indefinitely.
Which could lead to
limited responses from some NATO members, maybe just supplying hardware, not engaging more directly. There's also that notion, discussed on Reddit, of a potential grander scheme. Iran, Russia, North Korea, China acting together, trying to overwhelm the US and NATO across multiple theaters simultaneously: Europe, Middle East, Pacific. That would stretch Western resources, attention, make things much harder to manage.
So how do we move towards what Rusai calls a successful political conclusion, given all this complexity, the attrition, the global shifts?
Rusai emphasizes that while Ukraine's ultimate goal is lasting peace, the immediate military goal is stabilizing the front. That requires fixing those tactical problems we discussed and consistent international support. Interestingly, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi said recently, July 3rd, 2025, there is no simple solution to complex issues, but also, significantly, it is better to talk than to fight.
A diplomatic signal.
It seems so. He welcomed efforts towards a comprehensive, lasting, and binding peace agreement and building a balanced, effective, and sustainable European security architecture. That suggests a long-term diplomatic effort is seen as necessary, running alongside the military and economic pressures, maybe involving new security frameworks that acknowledge Russia's concerns but uphold sovereignty. The lack of a quick military fix means diplomacy, however hard, remains the ultimate path.
So, after all that, what does this deep dive mean for you, listening right now? We've seen a world rapidly reorienting. NATO aiming for a major military buildup, Russia leveraging military persistence in this incredibly sophisticated information warfare, despite huge economic strains. And the war in Ukraine grinding on, demanding resources, reshaping tactics, the implications for global stability, for your own economic well-being, even for the information you see every day, they're profound.
And this raises a really important question, doesn't it? It extends beyond geopolitics right into your daily life. In a world where information itself is weaponized, where geopolitical goals are pursued through overt military action and covert influence campaigns designed to blur the truth, how do you critically assess the narratives you encounter every single day? That ESE's report highlighted the immense challenges researchers, civil society face encountering FEMI. It strongly suggests that a fundamental understanding of these tactics, from deepfakes to fake websites using bulletproof hosting, is crucial for absolutely everyone. So the question for you is, what steps might you take to become a more discerning consumer of information in this incredibly complex, contested global information space? How might that critical thinking protect you from being unknowingly influenced?
That is a powerful thought to leave everyone with. Understanding the forces at play, both on the physical battlefield and in the digital realm, feels more important now than ever before. We really hope this deep dive has given you a clearer picture and maybe some essential tools to keep exploring these critical issues.